Imagine standing on the edge of a world that feels both ancient and terrifyingly new. The year is 1620, and the Atlantic Ocean, a grey, churning monster of salt and ice, is finally behind you. You are standing on the rugged coast of what will one day be called New England, but for now, it is simply a vast, silent wilderness of towering white pines and oak trees that seem to swallow the very light of the sun. The air is so cold it stings your lungs, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. This is the beginning of colonial America, a place where the line between survival and the great unknown is as thin as the walls of a hand-hewn timber cabin. Before we drift deeper into the quiet struggles and the rustic rhythms of the 17th century, I want to take a moment to welcome you. My name is Manuel, and it is truly a pleasure to have you here tonight. Welcome to Still Night History, your sanctuary for the stories the world has forgotten, the quiet, the mundane, and the fascinatingly boring details of the past that are perfect for a restful night's sleep. If you find peace in these journeys through time, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and join our growing community of history lovers. Please, leave a like on this video to help others find their way to our fireside, and I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, from which country are you watching us tonight? Your presence here, from every corner of the globe, is what makes these long nights of research so rewarding. Now, let the modern world fade away. Let the hum of electricity and the glow of screens dissolve into the flickering amber light of a tallow candle. To understand the colonial mind, we must first understand the colonial silence. In the 1600s, when the sun dipped below the horizon, the darkness was absolute. There were no streetlights, no distant sirens, only the wind whistling through the cracks of a mud-plastered chimney and the occasional howl of a timber wolf in the distance. The colonists lived by the sun's law. Their lives were dictated by the natural cycle of light and dark, a rhythm that we, in our electrified age, have almost entirely lost. The first structures built by these settlers were not the quaint saltbox houses you see in history books. They were English wigwams or the dugouts, crude shelters carved into the sides of hills or built from branches and turf. Imagine the dampness of the earth pressing against your back as you try to sleep, the floor a patchwork of packed dirt and dry grass. These people weren't just building a colony, they were trying to convince the wilderness to let them stay. Every nail was a luxury, every pane of glass a treasure brought across 3,000 miles of ocean. As we settle into this exploration of colonial life, we aren't looking for the great battles or the famous beaches. Instead, we are looking for the texture of the everyday. We are looking at the heavy pewter spoons, the rough wool of a waistcoat, and the smell of salt pork boiling in a cast iron pot. We are looking at the laws that governed how a person could walk, speak, and even dress on a Sunday. This was a society built on the pillars of hard labor and ironclad faith, where the stakes were nothing less than the soul and the stomach. As you lie there, feel the weight of your blankets and compare them to the heavy, hand-woven linens of a colonial bed. Imagine the great room of a house, where the fireplace is the beating heart of the home. It never goes out. To let the fire die was to invite the freezing hand of death into the house. The wood, mostly hickory and oak, crackles softly, a sound that has comforted humans for millennia. In this space, the air is thick with the scent of drying herbs hanging from the rafters, sage, rosemary, and thyme, meant for both seasoning and medicine. The colonial morning didn't start with an alarm, but with the biting chill of a room that had lost its heat by 3 a.m. The first person up, usually the mother or an older daughter, would stir the embers, feeding the fire until the room glowed again. Water was hauled from a frozen well, the ice broken with a heavy iron bar. This was a world of physical resistance. Everything required effort. Every sip of water, every slice of bread, every inch of warmth was earned through sweat and endurance. But within that hardship, there was a profound simplicity. There was a direct connection to the land that we can only dream of today. As we continue tonight, we will explore the strange legal codes that kept the peace, the bizarre medical practices that were thought to save lives, and the surprisingly complex social etiquette of a people who lived in wooden boxes in the middle of a dark forest. So, breathe deeply. Let your shoulders relax. Let the voice of the past carry you toward a deep, undisturbed slumber as we step further into the dusty, quiet halls of colonial America. You are safe here, wrapped in the soft fabric of history, as the fire burns low and the shadows dance on the timber walls. We are just beginning our long walk through the 17th century, and there is so much more to see in the quiet corners of the New World. To understand the rhythm of a colonial day, you have to understand the sheer weight of the tools. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there was no such thing as a lightweight object. A kettle was made of thick, black cast iron that required 2 hands to lift. A door was a heavy slab of oak, reinforced with iron spikes. Even the clothes on a colonist's back were heavy, thick wool sheared from their own sheep, spun on a wheel that hummed in the corner of the kitchen for hours every night, and woven into a fabric so stiff it could almost stand up on its own. As you lie there, imagine the contrast between your soft, modern environment and this world of iron, wood, and stone. The colonial house was a sensory experience that we can hardly imagine today. The dominant scent wasn't just wood smoke, it was a complex layering of smells that told the story of survival. There was the sharp, acidic tang of vinegar used for preserving vegetables, the heavy, sweet scent of drying tobacco hanging from the rafters, and the earthy, musky smell of damp wool drying near the hearth. In the corner, a barrel of salted fish or pork sat, providing the saltiness that hung faintly in the air. This wasn't a clean, sterile environment. It was an organic one, where every object had a life and a scent of its own. Let's focus on the fireplace, the great hearth. In a colonial home, the fireplace was often large enough for a grown man to stand inside. It was the only source of heat, the only stove for cooking, and the primary source of light during the long winter months. The fire was never allowed to go out. If it did, it was considered a minor catastrophe, requiring someone to run to a neighbor's house, sometimes miles away, to bring back a live coal in a perforated metal box. Imagine the responsibility of the firekeeper, usually the youngest child or the mother, ensuring that the embers stayed glowing under a layer of ash throughout the night. The sound of the hearth, the rhythmic popping of sap in a hemlock log and the low roar of the draft, was the soundtrack to every colonial life. The furniture in these homes was built for utility, not comfort. A settle was a long wooden bench with a very high back, designed specifically to trap the heat of the fire against the backs of those sitting on it while blocking the icy drafts that whistled through the cracks in the floorboards. There were no upholstered chairs or soft cushions. If you wanted comfort, you added a sheepskin or a sack stuffed with corn husks. The table was often just a long board placed over trestles, which could be dismantled and leaned against the wall to make room for sleeping. Space was a luxury, and every inch of the house had to serve multiple purposes. As the morning light, a pale, filtered gray, began to seep through the small, diamond-paned windows, the house would wake up not with a bang, but with a series of heavy, metallic clanks. The swinging of the iron crane in the fireplace, the scraping of a shovel against the stone hearth, and the thud of a butter churn. Butter was a staple, but it was earned through hours of rhythmic, mind-numbing labor. A child might sit for 2 hours, moving the wooden dasher up and down, until the cream finally broke and the yellow flecks of butter appeared. This was the boring reality of the past, a life made of repetitive motions that anchored a person to the present moment. Water was another heavy burden. There were no pipes, no faucets. Every drop of water used for drinking, cooking, or the rare occasion of washing was hauled from a well or a nearby spring. In the winter, this meant trudging through knee-deep snow with wooden buckets balanced on a yoke across the shoulders. The water was precious. It wasn't wasted. A single basin of water might be used by the entire family to rinse their hands before a meal, starting with the father and ending with the youngest child. In this world, time was measured by the shadow clock. Many colonial homes had noon marks cut into the floorboards near a window or door. When the sun's shadow reached that specific scratch in the wood, the family knew it was midday. There were no ticking clocks on the walls for most families. They lived by the movement of the heavens and the tolling of the meeting house bell. It was a slower way of existing, where a minute didn't feel like a digital countdown, but like a natural breath. The colonists were also obsessed with the weather. Not as a topic of small talk, but as a matter of life and death. A late frost meant the apple blossoms would die, and there would be no cider, the primary drink of the colonies, for the winter. A long drought meant the corn would wither, leading to the starving time. They watched the sky with a desperate intensity, reading the clouds and the behavior of birds like a holy text. When you hear the wind outside your window tonight, imagine it through their ears, as a messenger bringing either the rain they prayed for or the frost they feared. As we move into the next part of our journey, we will look at the clothing, the second skin of the colonist, and how a simple linen shirt represented weeks of labor. But for now, just settle deeper into your pillows. Imagine the flickering orange light of that great colonial hearth casting long, slow shadows across the wooden ceiling. You are drifting back, further and further, into a time where the world was quiet, the work was hard, and the nights were very, very long. The air is cool, the blankets are heavy, and the history is unfolding softly around you. Consider the fabric of a colonist's life, quite literally, the second skin they wore from dawn until the dying embers of the hearth. In the colonial era, clothing was not something you bought on a whim, it was a heavy, structural investment of time. For most settlers, a single linen shirt or a wool waistcoat represented months of labor, beginning not at a store, but in the dirt of a flax field or on the oily back of a sheep. As you lie there, feel the lightness of your own clothes and compare them to the coarse, honest weight of homespun. To the colonist, a garment was a shield against the jagged edges of the wilderness, a barrier against the biting Atlantic wind, and a marker of one standing in a very strict society. The process of creating clothing was the background hum of every colonial household. Imagine the sound of the loom, a rhythmic thump-clack, that filled the small rooms for hours every day. Before a single thread could be woven, the flax had to be grown, harvested, rotted in water to loosen the fibers, beaten with a wooden brake to crack the stems, and finally heckled or combed through iron spikes until it looked like soft, blonde hair. This boring and repetitive work was the foundation of their world. It was a meditative process, a slow transformation of a plant into a fabric that would last a decade or more. Linen was precious, it was cool against the skin in the humid Virginia summers and became softer with every single wash, eventually ending its life as a scrub rag or, if the family was lucky, paper. Wool was the other pillar of their wardrobe. Every spring, the sheep were washed in a cold stream and shorn. The wool was then carded, brushed between two boards with wire teeth, to align the fibers before being spun into yarn on the great wheel. This wheel was a constant companion in the colonial kitchen, its low, whirring moan a lullaby to the children sleeping nearby. A woman might walk 20 miles a day just stepping back and forth as she spun the yarn. This wasn't just a chore, it was a survival skill. Without wool, the damp, bone-chilling winters of Plymouth or Massachusetts Bay would be lethal. The colors of colonial America were not the bright, synthetic neons we see today. They were the colors of the earth, muted and deep. Dyes were harvested from the woods and the garden, yellow from goldenrod or onion skins, brown from walnut hulls, and red from the roots of the madder plant. The most prized color was indigo blue, a deep, oceanic hue that was a sign of a well-to-do family. When you imagine a colonial village, don't picture a black and white movie. Picture a palette of moss greens, rusted oranges, and sky blues, all fading slightly under the harsh colonial sun. These colors were a connection to the landscape, literally wearing the pigment of the forest on one's back. The way a person dressed was also governed by sumptuary laws. In many colonies, especially in New England, it was actually illegal to dress above your station. If you were a laborer and you were caught wearing gold lace or silk ribbons, you could be fined or brought before the magistrate. The authorities believed that a person's outward appearance should reflect their inner humility and their economic reality. This created a society where everyone's social rank was visible at a single glance. A silk hood or a silver button wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a political statement, a tiny rebellion against the rigid structure of the community. Let's talk about the shift or the chemise. This was the most important garment for both men and women. It was a long, loose linen tunic worn directly against the skin. It served as underwear, as a shirt, and as pajamas. Because the outer wool garments were difficult to wash, the linen shift acted as a sponge for the body's oils and sweat. Washing day was a massive, once-a-month ordeal involving giant copper kettles of boiling water and caustic lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat. The boring reality of cleanliness involved scrubbing these heavy linen shirts against rocks or wooden boards until the knuckles bled. When the clean laundry was finally hung on a hedge to dry, the scent of lavender or simple sun-dried linen was the ultimate reward. Leather was another essential. Every town had a tanner and a cordwainer, or shoemaker. Shoes were often straight, meaning there was no difference between the left and the right foot. You simply wore them until your feet broke the leather in, a painful process that lasted weeks. There were no laces as we know them, shoes were fastened with simple buckles or leather thongs. A pair of boots was a prized possession, often mended dozens of times with thick patches of cowhide until the original leather was almost entirely gone. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the feeling of taking off a heavy wool coat after a day of labor in the fields. Imagine the relief of the soft, worn linen of a night shift against your skin as you climb into a bed of straw. The world outside is dark and cold, but inside, you are wrapped in the results of a year's worth of spinning, weaving, and sewing. The rhythm of the loom has faded, the spinning wheel is silent, and the only sound is the soft crackle of the wool blankets as you settle in. You are part of the slow, deliberate pace of the 1700s, where every thread has a story and every garment is a testament to human patience. Breathe in the scent of cedar and clean wool, and let the quiet industry of the past soothe your mind into a deep, restful sleep. Now, let us turn our minds to the colonial kitchen, a place that was less of a room and more of a sensory battlefield against hunger. In our modern world, a meal is often a matter of minutes, a microwave beep, a plastic seal broken, a quick stir. But in the 1700s, dinner began hours, sometimes days, before the first bite was taken. As you lie there, imagine the heavy, rhythmic thud of a wooden pestle hitting a stone mortar. This was the sound of corn being ground into meal, a task that fell to the women and children of the household nearly every single day. Corn was the golden backbone of the colonies, a gift from the indigenous peoples that saved the early settlers from certain starvation. It wasn't the sweet, yellow corn we eat off the cob today, it was hard, flinty, and required immense physical effort to transform into something edible. The centerpiece of the kitchen was the pot. Not a light aluminum pan, but a massive, three-legged iron cauldron that sat directly in the embers or hung from a swinging iron crane called a pot hook. This pot was the hearth's constant companion. Inside, a perpetual stew often simmered, a mix of whatever was available, salted pork, dried peas, cabbage, and root vegetables like turnips or parsnips. Because refrigeration was non-existent, the pot was rarely emptied, new ingredients were simply added to the old, and the heat of the fire kept the bacteria at bay. The smell was thick and savory, a mingling of wood smoke and slow-cooked fat that defined the atmosphere of every colonial home. Bread was another labor of love, or perhaps, a labor of endurance. Most colonial families did not have a brick oven inside their house, those were luxuries for the wealthy. Instead, they used a Dutch oven, a heavy iron pot with a rimmed lid where live coals could be placed on top to create heat from both directions. The bread was often Johnny cakes or hoe cakes, flat, dense cakes of cornmeal and water, sometimes sweetened with a bit of maple syrup or molasses if the family was lucky. Molasses was the primary sweetener of the era, a thick, dark, sulfurous byproduct of the sugar trade that found its way into everything from baked beans to medicinal tonics. Imagine the slow, viscous drip of that dark syrup into a wooden bowl, the smell of burnt sugar filling the small, dim kitchen. Drinks were equally fascinating. Water, as we discussed, was often suspect, frequently carrying diseases that the colonists didn't yet understand. As a result, everyone, from the oldest grandfather to the youngest toddler, drank fermented beverages. Hard cider was the king of the colonial table. Every farm had an apple orchard, not for eating raw apples, but for pressing them into juice that would ferment in wooden barrels in the cellar. In the evening, a pewter tankard of cider would be warmed by the fire, perhaps with a red-hot iron poker plunged into it to make it hiss and foam. This was the tflip, a comforting, malty drink that helped the settlers forget the biting cold outside the timber walls. The boring reality of the colonial diet was its repetition. You ate what was in season, or what you had successfully dried, salted, or pickled the previous autumn. Spring was actually the hardest time, the starving time, when the winter stores were running low and the first green shoots hadn't yet appeared in the garden. Imagine the sight of a colonial cellar in late March, rows of empty wooden crates, a few shriveled apples, and the last of the salt pork hanging from a hook. This uncertainty created a deep, spiritual connection to the earth. A good harvest wasn't just a win for the economy, it was a physical reprieve from the fear of hunger. Eating was a communal, but often silent, affair. In many humble homes, there weren't enough chairs for everyone. The children would often stand at the table while the father and mother sat at a. There were few forks. The fork was a newfangled, Italian invention that didn't become common in America until the mid-1700s. Instead, people used knives, spoons made of horn or wood, and their own fingers. A trencher, a wooden plate, or even a hollowed-out piece of stale bread served as the vessel for the stew. When the meal was done, the plate was eaten or thrown to the dogs, leaving nothing to wash but the spoons. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the kitchen fire dying down to a soft, pulsing orange glow. The heavy iron pot has been pushed to the side, its contents cooling slowly. The smell of cornmeal and cider lingers in the air, a comforting reminder that the belly is full and the house is secure for another night. The world of the 1700s is one of slow digestion and deep, earned rest. Feel the stillness of the colonial night settling over you, as the sounds of the kitchen, the clink of pewter, the scrape of the hearth, fade into the distance. You are fed, you are warm, and you are safe in the quiet embrace of history. Let your breath slow down, matching the steady, ancient rhythm of the flickering embers. Sleep is coming now, as natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons in the New World. Now, let us step out of the kitchen and into the colonial backyard, which was less of a lawn and more of a living pharmacy. In the 1700s, there were no drugstores, no plastic bottles of aspirin, and very few trained doctors. If you fell ill, your survival depended on two things: the strength of your own constitution and the knowledge stored in the physic garden and maintained by the women of the house. As you lie there, imagine the scent of crushed mint, dried lavender, and the bitter, earthy tang of yarrow hanging in the rafters. This was the boring but vital science of the era, a world where every weed had a purpose and every flower was a potential lifesaver. Medical care in colonial America was a strange blend of ancient folklore, religious faith, and a desperate, trial-and-error approach to the human body. The prevailing theory of the time was based on this for humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It was believed that illness was simply an imbalance of these fluids. To fix the balance, the cure was often as grueling as the disease. Bleeding was a common practice, where a small incision was made to let out the excess blood, or leeches were applied to the skin. Imagine the quiet of a sick room, the only sound being the drip of a candle and the rhythmic ticking of a pulse as a mother watched over her feverish child, praying that a poultice of mustard and onions would draw the bad air out of their lungs. But beyond these harsh treatments, there was a gentler side to colonial medicine, the simples. These were herbal remedies passed down through generations. Sage was used for gargles to soothe a sore throat. Chamomile was brewed into a golden tea to calm a restless mind, much like you are seeking calm now. Dill wasn't just for pickles, it was steeped in water to cure griping or stomach aches in infants. Every colonial woman was expected to be a botanist, a chemist, and a nurse. She spent her summers drying bundles of herbs and her winters steeping them in tallow to make salves or in cider to make tinctures. The boring work of stripping leaves from stems and grinding roots in a mortar was the only shield the family had against the invisible threats of smallpox, yellow fever, and the common winter pleurisy. Sleep itself was often seen through a medicinal lens. If a person couldn't rest, they might be given a pillow stuffed with dried hops, whose earthy, sleepy scent was thought to induce deep slumber. Or perhaps a drop of laudanum, a potent mix of opium and alcohol, though that was a dangerous luxury. For most, the cure for a racing mind was simply the weight of a heavy wool quilt and the warmth of a warming pan. Imagine a long-handled brass pan, filled with hot coals from the hearth, being slid between the ice-cold linen sheets just minutes before you climb in. The hiss of the heat meeting the fabric, the sudden bloom of warmth in a room that is otherwise freezing, this was the colonial version of a luxury spa treatment. The great smallpox was the shadow that hung over every colonial decade. Before Edward Jenner and the cowpox vaccine, the colonists practiced variolation, a terrifying process where a small amount of live smallpox was introduced into a healthy person's arm in hopes of triggering a mild case. It was a gamble with death, often performed in pest houses on the edge of town. Imagine the bravery it took to walk into one of those houses, voluntarily getting sick to avoid a worse fate later. It reinforces the idea that the colonial life was one of constant, calculated risk. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, played a massive role in their health. The colonists believed that pores in the skin were dangerous openings through which disease could enter. Therefore, full-body bathing in water was actually avoided, as it was thought to weaken the body's defenses. Instead, they performed dry washes, scrubbing their skin with rough linen cloths to remove dirt and oil. Cleanliness was measured not by the smell of the body, but by the whiteness of the linen shirt. If your collar and cuffs were snowy white, you were a clean person, regardless of when you last saw a bathtub. As you feel the freshness of your own sheets, imagine the scratchy, honest cleanliness of a colonial man who has just changed into a fresh linen shift after a week of labor. Dental care was perhaps the most boring and painful of all. There were no toothbrushes. Instead, people used chew sticks, twigs of birch or hazel frayed at one end, and rubbed their teeth with a mixture of salt and soot. If a tooth rotted, there were no fillings. The local blacksmith or barber would simply pull it out with a pair of iron pliers, often with nothing more than a swig of rum to dull the pain. This is why, in many colonial portraits, no one is smiling with their teeth showing. It wasn't just because they were serious, it was because a full set of white teeth was a rarity. As we move deeper into the night, think of the resilience of these people. They lived in a world without safety nets, yet they found comfort in the predictable cycles of the garden and the hearth. Let the scent of those drying herbs, the rosemary for memory, the lavender for peace, fill your imagination. Feel your body becoming heavy, anchored by the same gravity that held the colonial farmer to his soil. The physic garden is silent now, the herbs are sleeping under the moonlight, and you are free to let go of the worries of the modern world. You are in the care of history now, where the remedies are simple and the rest is deep. Breathe in the cool, herbal air of the 18th century, and let yourself drift away. Now, let us step out of the sickroom and onto the muddy, rutted King's Highway, the lifeline of the colonies. In the 1700s, travel was not a matter of speed, but of survival and immense patience. To go from Boston to New York was not a 5-hour drive, but a grueling 2-week expedition on horseback or in a jolting, springless stage wagon. As you lie there, feel the absolute stillness of your room and compare it to the bone-shaking reality of a colonial journey. The world didn't move at 60 miles per hour, it moved at the pace of a walking horse, roughly 3 miles per hour, dictated by the strength of an animal's legs and the depth of the mud. The roads were often little more than widened Indian trails, littered with stumps, boulders, and sloughs of despond, pockets of mud so deep they could swallow a wagon wheel to the hub. In the winter, these ruts froze into iron-hard ridges that could snap an axle in an instant. In the spring, they turned into soup. Travel was so boring and slow that it became a meditative exercise. You didn't look at the landscape through a window, you were in it. You felt every change in elevation, every shift in the wind, and every drop of rain that seeped through your heavy wool cloak. Because travel was so difficult, the ordinary, or the tavern, became the social cathedral of colonial America. Imagine the sight of a flickering lantern hanging outside a timber-framed building as dusk falls. For a weary traveler, the tavern was the only source of warmth, news, and a hot meal for miles. But a colonial tavern was not a hotel. There were no private rooms. If you paid for a bed, you were actually paying for a space in a bed, often sharing a straw-stuffed mattress with 2 or 3 total strangers. You might find yourself sleeping back-to-back with a merchant, a sailor, or a frontiersman, everyone huddled together under heavy, communal quilts to keep the night chill at bay. The air in these taverns was thick, a heavy, swirling fog of pipe tobacco, roasting meat, and the yeasty scent of warm beer. It was here that the news of the world arrived. Since there were no daily newspapers for most of the century, news was oral. A traveler coming from the coast would sit by the fire, a tankard of flip in hand, and recount the happenings in London, the price of tobacco in Virginia, or the latest rumblings of discontent against the king's taxes. The boring wait for information made every word precious. People would listen for hours, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of the hearth, absorbing every detail of a world they would likely never see with their own eyes. Communication was equally slow. If you wrote a letter to a relative in England, you might not receive an answer for 6 months, if at all. Ships were lost at sea, mail bags were soaked in salt water, and inland couriers were often delayed by flooded rivers. This created a profound sense of localism. Your world was the 10 miles surrounding your farm. Anything beyond that was the frontier or the old country. This isolation is what gave the colonies their unique character, a blend of fierce independence and a desperate need for community when a stranger finally knocked on the door. Imagine the sound of the stagecoach horn echoing through the woods, a bright, brassy note that signaled the arrival of the mail and the outside world. The horses would be lathered in sweat, their breath huffing in the cold air as they were unhitched and replaced with a fresh team. The boring repetition of hitching and unhitching, the greasing of wheels, and the tightening of leather harnesses was the mechanical heartbeat of the colonies. It was a world held together by hemp rope, iron bolts, and the sheer endurance of muscle. For the common person, travel was rarely for pleasure. You traveled to go to the meeting house on Sunday, or to take your grain to the mill. The mill was another hub of colonial life. Imagine the low, vibrating hum of massive granite stones grinding together, powered by the relentless rush of a cold stream. The smell of fresh flour, dusty, sweet, and earthy, filled the air. Waiting for your grain to be ground was a half-day affair, a time to sit on a wooden crate, watch the water wheel turn, and simply be. There was no urge to check a device or optimize the time. The time was owned by the water and the stone. As you settle deeper into your bed tonight, imagine yourself as that weary traveler who has finally reached the inn. You've taken off your heavy, mud-caked boots. Your feet are warming by a fire that has been burning since the house was built. The noise of the tavern is fading into a low, rhythmic murmur. The strangers in the room are just shadows now, they're breathing steady and calm. The world outside is vast, dark, and silent, but here you are protected. The King's Highway is still there, stretching out into the pines, but you don't have to walk it tonight. You are at rest. Feel the weight of the history around you, the millions of footsteps that came before yours, and let the slow, deliberate pace of the 18th century carry you into a dreamless, deep sleep. The journey is over for today. The horses are fed, the fire is banked, and the night is yours. Let us now turn our gaze toward the spiritual and social anchor of every colonial town, the meeting house. In the 1700s, this wasn't just a church, it was the courthouse, the town hall, and the moral compass of the entire community. As you lie there, imagine a building made of unpainted, weathered cedar boards, standing stark against a grey New England sky. There was no steeple in the early days, no stained glass, and certainly no heating. To enter the meeting house in January was to enter a refrigerator made of wood. Yet, every Sunday, without fail, the entire population would gather there, sitting on hard, backless benches for 5 or 6 hours at a time. This was the boring discipline of the soul. The sermons were not brief, a minister might speak for 3 hours, turn over his hourglass, and speak for 2 more. Imagine the sound of hundreds of people shivering in unison, their breath rising in white plumes toward the rafters. To stay warm, women brought foot stoves, small metal boxes filled with hot coals from their home hearths, while the men simply endured, their hands tucked into their heavy wool sleeves. If a person's head began to nod in the cold, the tithingman would pace the aisles. He carried a long pole with a heavy brass knob on one end for the men and a soft rabbit's tail on the other for the women. A sharp thwack on the skull or a tickle on the nose was the colonial reminder that even in exhaustion, one must remain present. The silence of the Sabbath was absolute. In many colonies, it was illegal to travel, to cook a large meal, or even to whistle on a Sunday. The world simply stopped. This created a profound, forced stillness that we can scarcely imagine. No shops were open, no iron was struck at the forge, and no carts moved on the road. The only sound was the wind in the pines and the rhythmic, droning voice of the preacher. While this sounds restrictive, it provided a mandatory day of rest from the back-breaking labor of the other 6 days. It was a day where the shadow clock didn't matter, only the timeless words of the Bible. But life wasn't all sermons and cold benches. The social fabric was also woven through bees. Because life was so difficult for a single family, the colonists invented communal work parties. There were husking bees for corn, quilting bees for blankets, and barn raisings. Imagine the sight of 60 men working in perfect, practiced synchronization to lift a massive oak frame into place. The sound of 60 hammers hitting iron nails at once, a metallic symphony that echoed across the valley. While the men built, the women prepared massive communal feasts of pea soup, baked beans, and brown bread. These events were the social media of the 18th century, a time to trade gossip, find a spouse, and reinforce the idea that no one survived the wilderness alone. The laws that governed these communities were equally fascinating and, to our modern ears, incredibly boring in their detail. There were laws against idleness. If you were caught wandering without a purpose, you could be placed in the stocks. There were laws against scolding. Women who were deemed too argumentative might be placed in a ducking stool and dipped into the town pond. And then there were the sumptuary laws we touched on before, ensuring that a simple farmer didn't try to look like a wealthy merchant. The goal was order. In a world where the forest was chaotic and dangerous, the town had to be a clockwork of predictable, humble behavior. Even the way people spoke was different, slower, more deliberate, and filled with agricultural metaphors. You didn't get to work, you put your hand to the plow. You didn't get angry, you were chafed. This language reflected a people who lived in constant contact with the physical world. Their metaphors were made of wood, wool, and wheat. As you listen to these words, feel the weight of the deliberate, slow-moving society. There was no rush to respond, no instant gratification. A conversation was like a fire, you had to feed it slowly and let it burn. As the sun set on a colonial Sabbath, the meeting house would fall silent. The people would walk back to their small homes, their footsteps muffled by the soft needles of the forest floor. The world was at peace, governed by a set of rules that were as old as the mountains. Imagine yourself walking that path now, the cold air crisp on your face, the smell of wood smoke beckoning you home. Your foot stove is still warm, a small comfort in a vast, dark world. As you settle back into your blankets, let the rigid laws and the long sermons fade into a gentle hum. You don't have to worry about the tithingman tonight. You don't have to shiver on a wooden bench. You are in the modern world, but you are carrying the boring, peaceful stillness of a colonial Sunday with you. Feel your muscles go limp, your jaw relax, and your mind grow quiet. The bee is over, the barn is raised, and the soul is at rest. Sleep is the only law you need to follow now. Breathe in the cool, silent history of the 1700s, and let yourself be carried away into a deep, protected slumber. Let us now descend into the boring yet vital heart of colonial survival, the root cellar. In our modern age, we have the hum of the refrigerator, a white box of constant cold that defies the seasons. But in the 1700s, the refrigerator was a dark, cool room dug deep into the earth beneath the kitchen floor or into the side of a nearby hill. As you lie there, imagine the transition from the dry, smoky warmth of the hearth to the damp, silent chill of the cellar. The air here is different, it smells of wet limestone, coal dirt, and the sweet, fermenting scent of hundreds of apples stored in wooden slats. This was the colonial bank account. If your cellar was full in November, your family would likely see the blossoms of May. If it was empty, the winter would be a long, slow hollow in the stomach. To put up the harvest was a month-long marathon of repetitive labor. Imagine the sight of thousands of carrots, parsnips, and turnips being laid out on the grass to dry. They weren't washed with a hose, they were brushed clean of clods of earth and then buried in boxes of dry sand. The sand kept the moisture in the vegetable but kept the rot out. There is something deeply rhythmic and boring about the act of burying a harvest, placing each carrot so it doesn't touch its neighbor, pouring the grit of the sand over it, and stacking the boxes in the dark. It was a ritual of insurance against the coming ice. In the shadows of the cellar, you would find that salt porked barrels. Pork was the king of colonial meats because a pig could forage in the woods for acorns and then be transformed into a year's worth of protein. The process of salting was intense. The meat was cut into slabs and packed into wooden barrels with layers of coarse bay salt so thick it looked like gravel. Over time, the salt drew out the moisture, creating a heavy, grey brine. This boring chemistry was what allowed a sailor to cross the Atlantic or a farmer to survive a blizzard. Before it could be eaten, the pork had to be soaked in fresh water for hours to remove the salt, a slow, patient preparation for a simple, salty meal. Then there were the strings. If you looked up at the ceiling of a colonial cellar or kitchen, you would see a forest of hanging objects. Long braids of white onions, golden garlic bulbs, and rings of dried apples and pumpkin. Drying was the most common form of preservation. Imagine a colonial child sitting by the fire for 3 days straight, peeling apples with a small iron knife and slicing them into perfect rings. These rings were then threaded onto linen strings and hung near the warmth to shrivel. They became leather fruit, tough and chewy, but a burst of summer sweetness in the middle of a February gale. This work, peel, slice, thread, peel, slice, thread, was the meditative pulse of the autumn. Cider, as we mentioned, lived here too. In the deepest, coolest corner of the cellar sat the hogsheads, massive wooden barrels containing 60 to 110 gallons of fermenting apple juice. The sound of the cellar was often the slow, rhythmic glub-glub of the barrels breathing as the sugar turned to alcohol. A colonial family might go through 20 barrels of cider in a single winter. It was their hydration, their social lubricant, and, in some ways, their medicine. To walk into the cellar and pull the wooden spigot, watching the amber liquid flow into a pewter pitcher, was one of the few true comforts of a dark winter evening. But the cellar was also a place of boring anxiety. Every week, the father or mother would descend with a candle to inspect the stores. They would look for the one bad apples that could spoil the barrel, or the fuzzy white mold beginning to creep across the salt pork brine. They were guardians of the family's life force. Imagine the flickering light of a single tallow candle dancing on the stone walls, reflecting off the glass jars of pickled beets and the dull skin of the winter squash. It was a quiet, lonely task, a moment of reflection on the fragility of life and the bounty of the earth. As you drift further into your pillows, imagine that cool, damp stillness of the root cellar. The world above is screaming with wind and snow, but down here, deep in the earth, everything is silent. The carrots are sleeping in their sand, the apples are breathing their sweet scent into the dark, the cider is slowly maturing in the oak. There is no rush here. There is only the slow, steady preservation of life. Feel your own body as a vessel of rest, tucked away from the noise and the wind of the modern world. You are put up for the night, safe and secure. The harvest of your day is done, and now it is time to simply exist in the quiet, cool darkness of sleep. Let your breath become as slow and rhythmic as the fermentation in those wooden barrels. The earth is holding you, the history is surrounding you, and the winter cannot reach you here. Close your eyes, breathe in the scent of the earth and the autumn, and let the boring peace of the colonial cellar guide you into a dreamless, deep slumber. Now, let us turn our attention to the boring yet vital rhythm of the colonial schoolroom. In the 1700s, education was not a brightly lit building with colorful posters and plastic desks. For many children, school began at the Bedtime school, which was quite literally the kitchen of a local widow or a neighbor who could read and write. As you lie there, imagine a small, dim room where the only sound is the crackle of the hearth and the high-pitched, rhythmic chanting of the alphabet. There were no paper notebooks for the beginners. Paper was a rare, expensive commodity brought by ship from Europe. Instead, a child's first encounter with the written word was through the hornbook. The hornbook was not a book at all. It was a small wooden paddle, roughly the size of a hand, with a piece of paper tacked to it containing the alphabet, the Lord's Prayer, and perhaps a row of Roman numerals. To protect the precious paper from sticky fingers and damp air, it was covered with a thin, translucent sheet of animal horn, scraped so thin you could see right through it. Imagine the texture of that smooth, yellowish horn under a child's thumb as they traced the letter A over and over again. This was the boring foundation of literacy, a wooden paddle, a sliver of bone, and hours of repetition. As a child grew older, they might graduate to the New England Primer, a tiny book filled with stern woodcut illustrations and rhyming couplets that taught both reading and religious morality. In Adam's Fall, We Sinned All, the children would recite in a dull, hypnotic unison. There was a peculiar, heavy silence in these schoolrooms. Discipline was absolute. If a student's mind wandered toward the window, where the squirrels were gathering hickory nuts for the winter, the whispering stick or the dunce cap was waiting. But for most, the school day was a slow, steady climb through the thicket of grammar and arithmetic. Penmanship was perhaps the most boring and painstaking art of the era. To write a single sentence, a student first had to master the quill. This wasn't a ready-made tool, it was a feather, usually from a goose, that had to be hardened in hot sand and then precisely cut with a penknife to create a nib. The ink was a dark, pungent liquid made from oak galls and iron salts. Imagine the focus required to dip that feather into the inkwell, wipe the excess, and press it against the rough, handmade paper without making a blot. The scratching of the quill, a dry, rhythmic scritch, was the heartbeat of the colonial intellectual life. It was a slow communication, you thought deeply about every word because every word cost time, ink, and effort. Arithmetic was called ciphering, and it was done mostly on small pieces of slate with a slate pencil. The sound of the slate, a soft, screeching rasp, filled the room as children calculated the price of a bushel of wheat or the weight of a hogshead of tobacco. There were no calculators, no shortcuts. Everything was long form, manual, and mental. This created a generation of people who saw the world in terms of fractions, weights, and measures. They understood the geometry of a fence line and the volume of a grain bin because they had spent their childhood scratching those numbers into stone. But for the girls of the colonies, education often took a different, more tactile path, the sampler. While the boys ciphered, the girls sat for hours with a needle and thread, embroidering the alphabet and decorative borders onto a piece of linen. This was more than a craft, it was a demonstration of patience, fine motor skills, and industry. Imagine a girl of 7 years old, sitting by the window to catch the last of the afternoon light, her fingers moving in a repetitive, hypnotic dance, down through the linen, up through the linen, pull the silk thread taut. Stitch, stitch, stitch. By the time she finished her sampler, she had practiced the discipline she would need for a lifetime of sewing, mending, and spinning. As the sun began to dip behind the tree line, the dame or the schoolmaster would close their book. The boring labor of the mind was over for the day. The children would pack their hornbooks into leather satchels and walk home through the long shadows of the oaks. The world was quiet, the air was cooling, and the knowledge they had gained was etched into their memories through the sheer power of repetition. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, let the image of that quiet, wooden schoolhouse settle your mind. You don't have to recite your lessons. You don't have to worry about the perfect slant of your quill. The ink is dry, the slates are wiped clean, and the alphabet is at rest. Feel the boring piece of a task completed. Your mind, like the colonial schoolroom at dusk, is becoming still and dark. The hearth is just a glow of embers now. Breathe in the scent of old paper and wood smoke, and let the rhythmic scratching of the past lull you into a deep, scholarly, and restorative sleep. The lesson is over, and the night is your reward. Let us now shift our focus to the boring yet vital industry of the colonial blacksmith. In every village, from the rocky coasts of Maine to the humid tidewaters of Virginia, the blacksmith's forge was the beating heart of physical survival. In the 1700s, almost nothing was made of plastic or light alloys. If you needed to hold a house together, cook a meal, or plough a field, you needed iron. As you lie there, imagine the atmosphere of the smithy, a dark, cavernous space where the air is thick with the scent of sulfur, scorched coal, and the metallic tang of cooling brine. The light here doesn't come from a window, but from the pulsing, rhythmic glow of the forge, an orange eye that watches the village all day long. The sound of the blacksmith was the metronome of the town. It was a two-beat rhythm, the heavy, dull thud of the hammer hitting the red-hot iron, followed by the bright, musical clink as the hammer bounced off the face of the anvil. Thud-clink, thud-clink. This repetitive melody was the soundtrack to colonial progress. To the blacksmith, iron was not a hard, unyielding substance. When heated to a cherry red or at sparking white, it became like clay. He used a massive pair of leather bellows, often 6 feet long, to pump air into the charcoal, creating a roar that sounded like the breath of a dragon. Imagine the physical effort of that rhythmic pumping, a slow, deep exertion that kept the fire alive. The boring reality of the blacksmith's work was the sheer number of nails. Before the Industrial Revolution, every single nail in America had to be hammered out by hand. A house might require 10,000 nails. Imagine a nail rod, a thin strip of iron, being heated, pointed, nicked, and then dropped into a header where the blacksmith would strike a single, precise blow to create the head. This was a task often given to young apprentices or even children. Heat, strike, cut, drop. Over and over, thousands of times a day. These nails were so precious that if a frontier cabin burned down, the settlers would sift through the ashes specifically to recover the iron nails to reuse them. But the blacksmith was also a boring artist of the functional. He made the hinges for the heavy oak doors, the latches that kept the wilderness out at night, and the crane that held the heavy stew pot over the kitchen fire. Each piece was unique, marked with the subtle hammer blows of its creator. There is a profound sense of permanence in this work. When you touch a piece of 18th century iron today, you are touching something that was meant to outlive its owner by centuries. It was a world built to last, a society that valued the boring durability of a well-set weld over the flashiness of a new trend. The quenching was the most dramatic moment of the day. When a tool, perhaps an axe head or a scythe, was finished, it was plunged into a wooden tub of cold water. The result was a violent, hissing scream of steam that filled the shop with a white mist. This tempered the steel, making it hard enough to bite into the ancient hardwoods of the American forest. Imagine that sudden silence after the hiss dies down, the blacksmith wiping his brow with a soot-stained leather apron, and the tool sitting there, dark and indestructible. When sunset arrived, the shop's heat cooled. The bellows would fall silent, and the clink of the anvil would cease. The blacksmith would bank the fire, covering the glowing coals with a thick layer of ash to keep them alive until the morning. The shop would become a place of shadows and cold iron. As you settle deeper into your blankets tonight, imagine yourself as that iron, once glowing and overworked, now cooling slowly in the quiet dark. You are being tempered by the stillness of the night. Feel the heavy, solid reliability of the history around you. You don't have to be the hammer or the bellows tonight, you are the finished work, resting on the wooden workbench. The village is quiet, the fire is banked, and the air is cooling. The scent of the forge, that earthy, metallic perfume, is fading into the smell of the pines outside. Your muscles can go limp, your breath can become as slow as the cooling metal. You are safe, you are durable, and you are at peace in the boring, steady heart of the 18th century. Let the rhythmic memory of the anvil lull you into a deep, heavy, and unbreakable sleep. The work of the day is forged, and the night is your rest. Let us now turn our attention to the boring yet vital architecture of the colonial fence. In the 1700s, a fence was not a decorative boundary, it was a legal document written in wood and stone. To own land in the colonies, you were often required by law to improve it, and the most visible sign of improvement was the fence. As you lie there, imagine the vast, unfenced wilderness of the American continent, an endless sea of ancient trees, and the slow, rhythmic labor of a man with a heavy iron axe, carving out a rectangle of order from the chaos. This was the boring foundation of property, the splitting of rails and the stacking of stone. The most iconic of these was the split-rail fence, often called a snake fence because of its zigzagging path across the meadows. Imagine the sound of a wooden beetle or a massive, heavy mallet hitting a wedge of iron. Thud, crack. Thud, crack. The oak or chestnut log would groan and then split with a sharp, clean snap, revealing the pale, sweet-smelling heartwood inside. To build a single mile of fence, a farmer had to split thousands of these rails. It was a task of immense, repetitive physical meditation. Each rail was 10 feet long, heavy with sap, and rough with bark. Stacking them in a zigzag pattern required no nails, no post holes, and no mortar, only the weight of the wood and the geometry of the angles. It was a boring puzzle that held back the wild hogs and kept the cattle from wandering into the corn. In the rocky soil of New England, the fence took a different form, the stone wall. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine the boring frustration of a colonial plow hitting a granite boulder just beneath the surface. Every spring, the frost would heave new stones to the top of the soil, a harvest of rocks that never ended. To clear a field for planting, every one of those stones had to be hauled to the edge of the clearing. This led to the creation of those low, moss-covered walls that still snake through the woods of Massachusetts and Connecticut today. There is a deep, heavy silence in a stone wall. It is a monument to the boring patience of a man and an ox, moving one stone at a time, fitting the jagged edges together until they became a solid, unmoving line. The fence viewer was a real and vital official in every colonial town. His job was to walk the boundaries of the village, inspecting every rod and perch of fencing. If a fence was too low or had a rotten rail, the owner was fined. A lawful fence had to be horse-high, bull-strong, and pig-tight. Imagine the boring walk of the fence viewer on a crisp October morning, his leather boots crunching on the fallen leaves, his wooden staff tapping against the rails. It was a slow, methodical census of the town's security. This obsession with boundaries reflected a deeper colonial need for order. In a world where the forest felt infinite and often threatening, a well-built fence was a psychological shield. It said, "Here is the civilization. There is the wild." But fences were also social places. The stile, a set of wooden steps built over a fence line, was where neighbors would pause to trade news. Imagine the leaning weight of two men, their elbows resting on the top rail, their eyes scanning the horizon for rain. They talked of the boring things, the price of salt, the health of a calf, the quality of the winter hay. The fence wasn't just a barrier, it was a horizontal spine that connected the community. It provided a place to rest the body while the mind processed the slow gossip of the county. Inside the garden, the fence became more delicate. The paling fence, what we now call the picket fence, was made of thin, hand-split cedar slats. These were often sharpened at the top to keep out the smaller predators, the rabbits and the foxes that eyed the kitchen garden. The sound of a hatchet sharpening a picket, a rhythmic shwip, 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 was the quiet music of a colonial afternoon. These palings were often left unpainted, weathering to a soft, silvery grey that matched the winter sky. As the sun sets over the colonial farm, the shadows of the fences stretch long and thin across the fields. The cattle are tucked behind their wooden walls, the corn is safe, and the boundaries of the world are secure. As you settle deeper into your blankets tonight, imagine yourself inside that circle of safety. You are fenced in from the worries and the chaos of the modern world. Your room is your clearing, your bed is your sanctuary. Feel the heavy, rhythmic peace of the stacked wood and the settled stone. You don't have to split any logs tonight. You don't have to haul any rocks. The fence viewer has passed by and found your boundaries to be strong and lawful. The wilderness is far away, and the night is quiet. Breathe in the scent of aged cedar and damp stone, and let the boring, steady reliability of the colonial landscape guide you into a deep, protected slumber. The world is in order, the gates are closed, and the rest is yours. Now, let us turn our attention to the boring yet fundamental art of the colonial well. In the 1700s, there was no sound of rushing pipes or the hum of a water heater. The lifeblood of the home lived deep in the dark, cold throat of the earth. To dig a well was a Herculean task of patience and precarious labor. As you lie there, imagine a small circle of disturbed earth in the middle of a clearing, and a man lowered into a hole by a fraying hemp rope. He is surrounded by the smell of damp clay, ancient stones, and the rising chill of the water table. This was the colonial source of purity, a vertical tunnel that connected the family to the hidden rivers of the New World. The construction of the well was a masterpiece of boring geometry. It wasn't just a hole, it was lined with dry-laid stone, fitted together without a drop of mortar, allowing the water to seep in while holding the weight of the world at bay. Imagine the sound of a bucket being lowered, the creak of the wooden windlass, a dry, rhythmic screechunk as the rope uncoiled. Then, the long silence as the bucket descended into the darkness, followed by the distant, hollow splash as it hit the surface 30 feet below. This sound was the heartbeat of the morning, a signal that the day's work could finally begin. Water was heavy. A single gallon weighs over 8 pounds, and a colonial family required dozens of gallons every day for cooking, cleaning, and watering the livestock. This meant that hauling water was a constant, repetitive physical meditation. Imagine a young boy or girl, their shoulders braced against a wooden yoke, carrying 2 sloshing buckets from the well to the kitchen. The rhythmic slap-slap of the water against the wood, the cold droplets stinging their ankles, and the steady, heavy trudge across the frozen mud. In the winter, the well sweep, a long, counterweighted pole that looked like a giant wooden crane, was used to lift the heavy loads. The sweep moved in a slow, graceful arc against the winter sky, a boring mechanical lever that made survival possible. The well house or that spring house was the colonial refrigerator's cousin. Because the water coming from deep underground remained at a constant, chilly temperature year-round, the area around the well was used to keep things cool. Imagine a small stone building built directly over a bubbling spring. Inside, the floor was covered in a shallow pool of crystal clear, icy water. Earthenware crocks of milk, cream, and butter were set directly into the water to prevent them from souring in the humid July heat. The sound of the spring house was a constant, musical trickle, a boring but beautiful lullaby that spoke of abundance and preservation. But the well was also a place of mystery and folklore. The water dowser was often called before the first spade hit the dirt. He would walk the land with a Y-shaped branch of witch hazel or willow, waiting for the wood to twitch or dive toward the earth. Whether it was science or superstition, the search for water was a spiritual event. A dry well was a tragedy that could force a family to abandon their land. Therefore, the well was treated with a quiet, almost religious respect. It was never left uncovered, the heavy wooden lid or a stone curb protected the purity of the deep. In the evening, the well sweep would fall silent. The last buckets were brought in, and the wooden lid was slid into place. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, imagine the profound stillness of that deep, dark water beneath the earth. It is calm, it is cold, and it is undisturbed. The world above may be filled with the noise of the wind and the rustle of the forest, but down in the well, there is only silence. Feel your own mind as that deep, quiet well. The surface is still. The depths are cool and clear. You have hauled all the water you need for today. Your work is done, and the windlass of your mind has stopped turning. The rope is coiled, the bucket is resting on the stone curb, and the night is peaceful. Breathe in the cool, damp scent of the spring house, and let the rhythmic trickle of the water lull you into a deep, crystalline, and restorative sleep. You are connected to the earth, you are replenished, and you are at rest. The water is still, and so are you. Let us now turn our attention to the boring yet rhythmic heart of the colonial laundry. In the 1700s, wash day was not a 30-minute cycle in a white machine, it was a grueling, 24-hour ritual of fire, water, and caustic chemistry that usually took place on a Monday. As you lie there, imagine the transition from the quiet of the Sunday Sabbath to the sudden, steam-filled industry of a Monday morning. The air is no longer filled with the scent of pine, it is thick with the smell of wood ash, rendered animal fat, and the humid, heavy scent of wet linen. This was the boring labor that defined the cleanliness of the soul and the status of the family. The process began long before the sun touched the horizon. The first task was the lye making. Imagine a wooden barrel filled with hardwood ashes from the kitchen hearth. Water was slowly poured over the ashes, leaching out a harsh, alkaline liquid called potash. This liquid was so strong it could burn the skin, yet it was the only way to break down the grease and oils of a month's worth of wear. To make soap, this lye was boiled in a massive copper kettle with tallow, the rendered fat of cows or sheep. The result was a slippery, grey-brown jelly that smelled of the farm and the forest. This was the boring alchemy of the backyard, a slow boiling that required constant stirring with a heavy wooden paddle. Then came the backing. In an era before the scrub boards, Clothes were placed in a large wooden tub and covered with a cloth. Hot lye water was poured over them again and again, a process that chemically loosened the dirt. Imagine the sound of the dolly or the pouring stick, the heavy wooden pole with a footed end, hitting the wet fabric. Thud, squelch. Thud, squelch. This was the rhythmic exercise of the morning, hours of pounding the heavy, waterlogged linen to force the soapy water through the fibers. A linen shift, when wet, could weigh 10 pounds, a wool blanket could weigh 30. The physical endurance required for wash day made it the most feared chore of the week. Rinsing was a journey in itself. The heavy tubs had to be dragged to the nearest stream or well. Imagine the shock of plunging your arms into the icy water of a New England brook in October, the current pulling at the fabric as you tried to rinse away the caustic lye. The boring repetition of wringing the cloth, twisting the heavy linen until the muscles in the forearms screamed, was the only way to ensure the soap didn't rot the fabric. Linen was a long-term investment, and a bad wash was a financial disaster. Then came the bleaching. The colonists didn't have chemical bleach, they had the sun. Clean, wet linens were spread out over the green, the grassy area behind the house, or draped over lavender hedges. This was called grass bleaching. The oxygen released by the grass combined with the ultraviolet light of the sun to whiten the fabric naturally. Imagine a colonial field covered in rows of white shifts and tablecloths, looking like a fallen cloud against the green earth. It was a silent, boring wait for the sky to do its work. The final stage was the ironing, which was less about removing wrinkles and more about pressing the fabric to make it smooth and dirt-resistant. The sad irons, heavy blocks of solid cast iron, were heated directly in the fire. They were called sad not because they were unhappy, but because the word meant heavy or solid in Old English. Imagine the focus required to lift a 7-pound iron, test its heat with a flick of a wet finger, and glide it over the linen. The hiss of the steam and the scent of toasted fabric filled the room. As the Monday sun sets, the wash day finally concludes. The linens are folded, smelling of the sun and the lavender hedge. They are stiff, crisp, and clean. As you settle deeper into your pillow tonight, imagine the feeling of that fresh, sun-bleached linen against your skin. You are wrapped in the results of a day's hard labor. The copper kettle is empty, the fire is out, and the lye has done its work. Feel the absolute cleanliness of your own space. You don't have to stir the soap, you don't have to pound the dolly. Your bucking is done for the week. The world is fresh, the fabric of your life is smooth, and the night is quiet. Breathe in the scent of sun-dried clover and clean cotton, and let the rhythmic memory of the pouring stick fade into a deep, purifying, and restorative sleep. You are clean, you are dry, and you are at peace in the quiet, white shadows of the 18th century. The Monday work is over, and the rest is yours. Finally, let us turn our gaze to the most boring yet profound transition of the colonial day, the banking of the hearth. In the 1700s, the day did not end with the flick of a plastic switch or the closing of a laptop, it ended with a ritual of fire and ash that ensured the family would wake up to warmth rather than a frozen tomb. As you lie there, imagine the house has grown dark. The only light remaining in the entire world, it seems, is the deep, pulsing crimson of the great kitchen fireplace. The air is cool, smelling of the night forest and the fading scent of the evening meal. This was the boring responsibility of the head of the household, the preservation of the spark. To bank a fire was an act of quiet, meditative engineering. You didn't just let the logs burn out. Instead, you used a heavy iron shovel to push the glowing red coals, the concentrated essence of the day's heat, to the very back of the stone hearth. Then, you carefully covered them with a thick, insulating blanket of grey ash. If you did it too tightly, the fire would suffocate. If you did it too loosely, the coals would burn away before midnight. It was a boring balance of oxygen and carbon. Imagine the sound of the shovel scraping against the soot-covered stone, a dry, rhythmic scritch slide, scritch slide. This sound was the goodnight of the 18th century. It signaled that the world was winding down, and the energy of the day was being stored for the morrow. As the embers disappeared under the ash, the great room would plunge into a true, velvet darkness. The colonists didn't have night lights. They had the tallow candle, a humble cylinder of rendered beef fat that sputtered and smoked, giving off a dim, yellow light that barely reached the corners of the room. Moving through the house with a single candle was a slow, deliberate process. You didn't run, you walked with a steady hand, shielding the tiny flame from the drafts that whistled through the floorboards. The shadows didn't just move, they danced, growing and shrinking against the rough-hewn timber walls. This boring lack of light forced a person to turn inward, to listen to the house breathing, the settling of the wood, the ticking of the cooling iron pot, and the wind in the chimney. Bedtime was a structural event. In the 1700s, most people slept in box beds or behind heavy woolen curtains. This wasn't for privacy, but for warmth. Imagine climbing into a high wooden frame, pulling the heavy curtains shut, and creating a tiny, warm microclimate for yourself. The boring reality of the mattress was often a sack stuffed with dried corn husks or straw. As you settled in, the mattress would rustle and crunch, a rhythmic, organic sound that told you that you were supported by the harvest itself. On top were the coverlets, heavy, hand-woven blankets with geometric patterns like Whig Rose or Lee Surrender. The weight of these blankets was immense, pressing you down into the straw, anchoring you against the vast, cold emptiness of the American night. The colonial night was a time of the great silence. Outside the walls, there were no engines, no humming wires, no distant city glow. There was only the boring and magnificent stillness of the stars. The colonists looked at the sky and saw the same constellations that guided the ancient mariners. They felt a connection to the cosmos that we have traded for convenience. As you breathe in the cool air of your own room, imagine that absolute, heavy silence of a 1750s farmstead. The livestock are silent in the barn, the tools are silent in the shed, the fire is silent under its bed of ash. You are the keeper of your own hearth tonight. You have pushed the worries of your day to the back of your mind. You have covered them with the ash of forgetfulness. The spark of your consciousness is safe, tucked away, waiting for the morning. You don't have to keep watch anymore. The house is secure, the boundaries are set, and the boring, beautiful history of the world is folding you into its embrace. Feel the weight of your own coverlets. Listen to the silence of your own great room. The shovel is leaning against the stone, the candle has been pinched out, the long, dark night of the colonies has arrived. You are drifting now, back through the centuries, into the deep, rhythmic sleep of the pioneers. The fire is banked, the spark is saved, and the rest is finally, truly yours.